There are certain questions a country will spend generations avoiding, not because no one can answer them, but because the answer forces people to rethink everything they believed about history, identity, and themselves. This is one of those stories. What happens when one of the most outspoken critics of America's establishment discovers that her own family tree leads directly back to the very foundation of colonial America? Imagine spending your entire life challenging the family to learn that your bloodline traces back to the people who helped build it. That is exactly what happened to Angela Davis. For decades, Angela Davis became one of the most recognizable voices for civil rights, prison reform, and social justice. She challenged the American government, appeared on the FBI's most wanted list, and spent over a year in jail while awaiting trial. To millions of people, she represented resistance against the country's historical power structure. Then came a discovery that stunned even her. During an episode of Finding Your Roots, hosted by historian Henry Louis Gates Jr., Davis was handed a document revealing something she never expected through documented genealogy. Her family lineage could be traced back to William Brewster, one of the passengers aboard the Mayflower in 1620. The short clip of her reaction quickly spread across social media, leaving millions of viewers shocked, but that viral moment told only a tiny part of the story. The full episode revealed a much deeper and more emotional journey, one involving hidden family secrets, generations of silence, racial history, and discoveries that challenged long-held assumptions about identity in America. So, was this discovery a contradiction of everything Angela Davis believed? Or did it actually reveal something even more profound about American history? Let's begin where the story truly starts. To understand why this discovery was so astonishing, you first have to understand who Angela Davis is and what she came to represent. Angela Yvonne Davis was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1944, during one of the most racially divided periods in American history. She grew up in a neighborhood known as Dynamite Hill, a place that earned its name because white supremacists frequently bombed the homes of black families who moved into previously segregated areas. This wasn't history she read about in books. It was the world she experienced as a child. One of the 4 young girls killed in the infamous 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church was someone Angela Davis knew personally. Living under the constant threat of racial violence shaped the way she viewed America from an early age. But instead of allowing fear to define her future, Davis turned to education. She studied at Brandeis University, spent time in Paris, and later continued her education in Germany, where she studied philosophy under some of the most influential Marxist thinkers of the 20th century. She immersed herself in the works of Karl Marx Hegel, Jean-Paul Sartre, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse, developing a deep understanding of politics, history, and systems of power. When she returned to the United States, she became much more than an academic. Angela Davis emerged as one of the country's most influential activists, arguing that racism, inequality, and mass incarceration were not isolated problems, but parts of a much larger system rooted in America's colonial past. For decades, she maintained that the nation's foundations were built on the displacement of indigenous people and the exploitation of enslaved Afrikaans, a legacy she believed continued to shape American society. And that is what makes the DNA revelation so extraordinary. The woman who spent her life analyzing the legacy of Americas. Colonial founders would soon discover that through documented genealogy, she was directly descended from one of them. That unexpected connection would become only the beginning of an even more remarkable story. At first, many people believed the Mayflower connection was the biggest surprise in Angela Davis's family history. It wasn't. As researchers dug deeper into her ancestry, using DNA evidence, census records, and historical documents, they uncovered an even more personal secretome that had remained hidden within her own family for generations. The investigation revealed that Angela Davis's father, Frank Davis, never actually knew the identity of his biological father. For years, the family believed one man was her paternal grandfather. But modern DNA analysis pointed to someone entirely different, a white neighbor named Murphy Jones, who had lived near Angela's grandmother, Molly Spencer. The evidence suggested that Murphy Jones was Frank Davis' biological father. This revelation was about far more than genealogy. During the Jim Crow era, relationships between black and white Americans were not only socially condemned, but in many places illegal. Such relationships could bring severe legal punishment, violence, or even death. As a result, countless families carried secrets that were never spoken aloud. Angela Davis's family was one of them. The DNA evidence showed that her family history reflected the same unequal racial system she had spent her entire life studying. Hidden relationships, enforced silence, and generations of unanswered questions had become part of her own story. In fact, genealogists have long observed that many African Americans carry significant European ancestry. This isn't because history was simple, it is because centuries of slavery, segregation, and unequal power left lasting marks on countless family trees. For Angela Davis, the DNA test didn't erase her identity. Instead, it revealed just how deeply America's complicated racial history had shaped her own family across generations. And as researchers continued tracing her lineage, another astonishing discovery was waiting just around the corner. Just when it seemed the biggest family secrets had already been uncovered, the research revealed another chapter that was even more difficult to process. Tracing Angela Davis, maternal family line genealogists discovered that one of her fourth great-grandfathers was Stephen Darden, a man who fought in the American Revolutionary War. At first, this seemed like a remarkable discovery. Here was an ancestor who had risked his life for the ideals of liberty and independence during the birth of the United States. For Angela Davis, who had spent much of her life being labeled un-American because of her activism, the revelation carried a powerful irony. Her own family included someone who had fought for the nation's independence from Britain, but the story didn't end there. Historical records reveal that after the war, Stephen Darden moved to Georgia and became a slaveholder. The same man who had fought for freedom later owned enslaved human beings. When Angela Davis learned this, she admitted she had always imagined her ancestors only as victims of slavery, not as people who had also participated in the institution itself. It was an emotional moment. Her family history contained both sides of one of America's greatest contradictions, people who struggled for freedom and people who denied that same freedom to others. Rather than offering simple answers, the discovery showed how complicated American history truly is. The same family tree could hold courage and cruelty, sacrifice and injustice all at once. And as researchers continued uncovering her ancestry, it became clear that the biggest debate wasn't about DNA alone. It was about how people interpreted what those discoveries actually mean. When Angela Davis's family history became public, the reaction spread quickly across social media, television, and news outlets. But instead of bringing people together, the discovery divided opinions almost immediately. Some conservative commentators argued that the Mayflower connection exposed a contradiction. They claimed that Davis had spent decades criticizing America's colonial foundations, only to discover that she herself was descended from one of the people who helped establish them. To them, it looked like a moment of irony. Others saw the story very differently. Many historians pointed out that ancestry is not something anyone chooses. Discovering who your ancestors were doesn't change the experiences you lived or the beliefs you formed throughout your life. As researchers continued examining Davis's family tree, another deeply personal truth emerged. On her mother's side, they identified her maternal grandfather as John Austin Darden, a respected white Alabama lawyer and legislator whose ancestry also traced back to William Brewster, one of the Mayflower passengers. But under the laws and social pressures of the Jim Crow era, acknowledging a relationship with a black woman could have destroyed his career and reputation. As a result, Angela Davis's mother, Sally Bell, grew up never knowing who her biological parents were. She spent much of her childhood in foster care, carrying questions that were never answered. That silence passed from one generation to the next. So when Angela Davis sat down for Finding Your Roots, she wasn't simply learning about famous ancestors. She was finally uncovering pieces of her own family's identity that had been hidden for decades. The discoveries didn't weaken her understanding of racial injustice. They illustrated how deeply segregation, discrimination, and enforced secrecy had affected countless American families, including her own. By this point, the story had become far bigger than a surprising DNA result. It had become a powerful reminder that history often leaves behind unanswered questions, and that modern genealogy is finally beginning to answer some of them. But perhaps the most important lesson was, by the time the research was complete, Angela Davis's family tree had become far more than a collection of names and dates. It had uncovered generations of forgotten stories that reflected the larger history of America itself. On her father's side, researchers traced her ancestry to Isham Spencer, a man who had been born into slavery on an Alabama cotton plantation in 1824. When the Civil War ended and slavery was officially abolished, Isham didn't simply accept his freedom and move on. He went to court to fight for the freedom of his nieces and nephews after a plantation owner attempted to keep them enslaved illegally. He won the case. Generations later, Angela Davis would find herself fighting her own legal battle, defending her freedom against charges that once carried the possibility of the death penalty. Although the circumstances were completely different, both ancestor and descendant found themselves standing in court, challenging systems they believed were unjust. On her mother's side, the story was equally emotional. Angela's mother, Sally Bell, grew up in foster care without ever knowing the identities of her biological parents. Through years of historical research, genealogists finally identified her father as John Austin Darden, a prominent white lawyer and state legislator in Alabama. When Angela Davis was shown an old photograph of Darden, she quietly noticed something remarkable. For the first time, she could see her mother's facial features reflected in someone she had never known existed. It was both a joyful and heartbreaking moment. Joyful because decades of unanswered questions finally had an answer. Heartbreaking because her mother had lived her entire life without knowing the father whose identity had been hidden by the racial realities of the Jim Crow era. These discoveries weren't simply filling gaps in a family tree. They were restoring pieces of a history that had been deliberately erased, proving that the silence surrounding race and identity affected countless families across generations. And with every new document, every DNA match, and every forgotten record uncovered, one message became impossible to ignore. Sometimes, the most powerful discoveries aren't about changing history. They're about finally revealing the history that was hidden all along. In the end, Angela Davis's DNA results didn't erase her life's work. If anything, they made her story even more powerful. For decades, Davis argued that race is not simply a matter of biology, but a social and political system that has shaped people's lives for centuries. Her own ancestry became a striking example of that idea. Her DNA revealed connections to both enslaved people and slaveholders, to black families whose histories had been erased, and to white families whose names had been carefully preserved. It showed that America's past is far more interconnected than many people realize. As DNA testing becomes increasingly common, millions of Americans are discovering family histories that cross racial, cultural, and social boundaries once thought to be fixed. These discoveries challenge long-held assumptions about identity and remind us that history is often more complex than the stories passed down through generations. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of Angela Davis' story isn't the Mayflower connection at all, it's the generations of silence. Her mother grew up without knowing who her parents were. Family relationships were hidden by the realities of segregation and Jim Crow, leaving questions that remained unanswered for decades. Only modern genealogy and DNA research finally uncovered those missing pieces. In the end, this story isn't about proving Angela Davis right or wrong. It's about showing how history leaves its mark on ordinary families. DNA cannot erase injustice. It cannot change the experiences people lived through, but it can uncover truths that were buried for generations, giving families answers they never thought they would find. Angela Davis's Ancestry reminds us that history is rarely simple. It is filled with contradictions, hidden connections, painful realities, and unexpected discoveries. Sometimes, the most important lesson is where our ancestors came from. It's what we choose to do with the truth once we finally know it.